The last 24 hours have been somewhat enigmatic because two big pieces of news that I expected to be discussing today have so far failed to happen. The first is the announcement of the dismissal of the military commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Valery Zaluzhny. I discussed yesterday in my program how it seemed that as the political crisis in Kiev was boiling over following President Zelensky's failed attempt to dismiss Zaluzhny on Monday, Victoria Nuland had dashed to Kiev, had apparently spoken to various people there, and seemed to have come down on Zelensky's side. And there was a report yesterday on CNN that the announcement of Zaluzhny's resignation would happen today. And also yesterday there was a very interesting interview by Mikhail Podolyak, Zelensky's advisor, in which he said that Zaluzhny's dismissal was no big deal, that he was only a military leader. The management of the war is always in the hands of the overall commander-in-chief, who is, of course, Zelensky himself. And that seemed to me an attempt to try to preempt criticism of Zaluzhny's dismissal by trying to play down its significance. Well, today has come. We're now, I think, in the early evening or late afternoon in Kiev. And so far there's been no announcement that General Zaluzhny has been dismissed. Now, of course, the day is not over. Perhaps we will get more reports over the next few hours and an announcement from Kiev over the next few hours, and we will learn that General Zaluzhny has indeed been dismissed. Or perhaps there's been another hitch and the announcement of the dismissal will be postponed till Monday or Tuesday or sometimes next week. But I have to say that the longer this saga drags on, the weaker Zelensky looks. If Nuland's visit to Kiev was indeed intended to buttress his authority by ensuring that he was able to get Zaluzhny dismissed, well, I have to say it might not have worked, which would be a very interesting fact in itself. But to reiterate again, if the president of a country at war is unable to dismiss his senior commander, then that shows that the situation in the country has become grave indeed, that the political situation is in deep crisis, and by the way, the military situation is in crisis also and likely to get worse. In fact, I repeat the point I made earlier this week. If at some point over the next few days, unless at some point over the next few days, or weeks at most, Zelensky is able to dismiss Zaluzhny, which no one any longer seriously doubts is what he is trying to do. Unless he does that, then he is president in name only. Power will drain away, and it will become clear that he is no longer in serious control of the military, and that the key decisions are no longer going to be made by him, but by others, by Zaluzhny and whatever political leaders, principally one suspects the former president Petro Poroshenko, Zaluzhny chooses to work with. So there we go. We are perhaps in the process of a slow motion coup. As I said, I give Zelensky only a few days or weeks. We'll see what happens. And obviously, if the situation changes, I will return to it I'm going to say, by the way, as an appendix to that, if by the middle of next week Zelensky is still occupying his post, then I think at that point I will return to the matter, and I think at that point it will become important to discuss when the likely date of Zelensky's final exit will be, because that will be, I think, the point which we are heading towards. Anyway, let's not jump ahead of ourselves. As I said, there's still more hours in the day. There's probably a few more days left. We'll see whether at some point soon President Zelensky is able to assert his authority and dismiss Zelensky, or if Zelensky has won the power struggle with Zelensky and is able to remain in control. Now, the second thing that didn't happen was American airstrikes and missile strikes on Iran and on Iranian forces across the Middle East. What we got instead was a statement from Pentagon Chief, the US Defense Secretary, General Lloyd Austin, who I should say looked very much to me as if he is still convalescing from his operation and his treatment for cancer, and perhaps as a result, and of course unintentionally, gave a rather fragile look when he was speaking to the media yesterday, which perhaps is not the best look to give when one is talking about military action in a place like the Middle East. But putting that aside, Lloyd Austin confirmed that over the next couple of days, at some point over the next couple of days, there will be American air and missile strikes in the Middle East against Iranian targets. He also made it clear that the United States is continuing to blame Iran for the attack on its base, Tower 22 of the sprawling Al-Tanf complex, though Tower 22, as it happens, is located across the border in Jordan. So, on the one hand, he did confirm that air and missile strikes by the United States will take place at some point over the next few hours or days. After his statement, to be frank, I had been expecting to be seeing news of them this morning. So far, these air and missile strikes have not come. And I got the strong impression, listening and watching Lloyd Austin, that his heart, at least, is not in this business. That he, at least, is one of those people who understands the enormous dangers, the tremendous problems that an all-out war in the Middle East would cause to the United States. He spoke about how the Middle East is at an extremely dangerous moment. Of course, it's not just the Middle East. One could argue that extends to the United States as well. And he also went out of his way, or so it seemed to me, to make clear that the United States is not looking for an all-out war in the Middle East. And the impression he gave was that these strikes, when they happen, and he made it clear there would be a sequence of them, we're not just looking at one strike, that the United States was going to try to calibrate them. That was the impression he gave, and that they would be at a rather moderate level, whatever that means. And for the record, we've also got reports that the administration, after much agonized discussion, and I suspect very strong pushback from the Pentagon, has supposedly decided to call off the idea of a direct strike on Iran itself. Apparently, it's understood that that would be incredibly dangerous. If there was a plan to try to strike somewhere in Iran, but to cause minimal damage and to persuade the Iranians not to retaliate in kind, well, all the reports suggest that the Iranians came back and said that that was nonsense. If there was an American strike on their country, the Iranians would treat it as a de facto act of war, and that they would respond in kind, that they would launch strikes against American military facilities right across the Middle East. If such a bizarre exchange did indeed take place, and I don't know that it did, by the way, we just got reports that it did. If such a bizarre exchange did indeed take place, then the Iranians, if there is now no strike on Iranian territory, the Iranians will know that the United States is afraid of striking Iran, which again, as someone who thinks that striking Iran is massively ill-advisable, it's perhaps, in my opinion, better that the Iranians know, and better that the Americans know it as well. But all the same, it does show a lack of strength by the United States in the Middle East. And if these strikes, which are now going to happen, are indeed on the limited scale that some are suggesting, and are only going to happen in daylight, well, all I can say is if that is indeed the case, and if Iran itself is not going to be a target for these strikes, then the Iranians will have won this round, even if they had no role at all in the attack on the base in Jordan, this strike in Jordan. The Ukrainians will have won this round, and many people in the region will feel and say that the American bluff has been called. I can't predict, by the way, what the outcome of that would be. My guess is that those with pugilistic and neocon opinions in Washington would be outraged, and we might start to see a response from them in parts of the media. But anyway, we're just going to have to wait. Now, all of this, of course, assumes that all this messaging is indeed accurate, and that we are going to get a limited strike, and that it won't be a strike on Iran. Of course, as Xi Jinping once told Joe Biden directly to his face over the course of a summit meeting the two leaders once had, the administration has a habit of saying it's going to do one thing and then doing something completely different. It could be that we're going to get a massive strike after all, and that it will target facilities and bases in Iran itself. In which case, of course, we will be having a different discussion completely about the entire situation. But for the moment, it looks as if the wiser and cooler heads have prevailed, that the United States is intending to pull its punches, and that there's not going to be an across-the-board attack in the Middle East and not a strike on Iran. And as I said, that might weaken that might strengthen the perception in the Middle East and in Iran itself that the United States is bluffing and is weaker than perhaps it actually is. But I will say, if we get a limited response, especially one that the Iranians have now been given massive notice of and have therefore been able to prepare for. There's reports circulating that they've scrambled out of the Middle East many of their top people and brought them back to Iran so that they've taken out of harm's way. Well, if that is the case, then I, for one, will breathe a sigh of relief and will hope that the wiser voices continue to be listened to and continue to prevail in the furious debates within the administration that continuously take place. I'm going to finish my comments on this topic by saying that if the United States has now come to a settled view that a strike on Iran is impossible because of the overwhelming response and the enormous dangers that might follow from it, if the United States has come to that view, if they also realize that attacks on people like the Houthis and the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon and the various forces in Iraq, the Shia militias and other militias in Iraq, that this is not going to achieve any successful military outcome and would be counterproductive, then the United States needs to reconsider radically its policy in the Middle East. It needs to start pulling troops out in order to get them out of harm's way. It ought to accept that its ability to control the Middle East has gone, and it ought to refashion its policies on that basis. Anyway, I am not going to say more. As I said, we might get a strike. Well, we will get a strike over the next couple of days. We will see what that strike amounts to. As I said, if it is as limited as is being said, I will discuss it on this channel and also on the Duran with my colleague Alex Christoforou, and we'll take a view and perspective on it. If, on the contrary, we're looking at a massive strike over the next couple of days, well, we will again discuss it, though our conclusions of where the situation is going will start to look, I think, very different. Anyway, let us return to the one crisis where there is an ongoing war, and that, of course, is the crisis in Ukraine. The war there continues, and the President Zelensky has not dismissed his military chief, his senior military chief, General Zaluzhny. The Russian defense minister, General Sergei Shoigu, has been speaking, and he is giving us a lot of information again, and it is interesting information. So this speech was made at a special teleconference with the leadership of the Russian armed forces, which took place today. He began by saying that today is a memorable date, the day of military glory of Russia, the day of the defeat of Nazi troops in the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, my understanding is that this isn't just an enormous day in Russia. Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, is by universal acknowledgement one of the pivotal moments, if not the pivotal moment, of the Second World War, especially on the Eastern Front. I also understand that today, as it happens, 2nd February, the city, which in 1943 was called Stalingrad, but which in the Tsarist era had for a time been called Tsaritsyn, and which after 1961, during the Soviet era of de-Stalinization, the Khrushchev thaw changed its name to Volgograd, which is its usual name still. Anyway, today, on the 2nd of February, and on a number of other commemorative days, it becomes briefly Stalingrad again. Just saying. Anyway, so this meeting was convened to commemorate the victory that the Soviet Union achieved in the Battle of Stalingrad, which is an important date and one which, of course, Russian soldiers will take extremely seriously. In fact, of course, there were other reasons for calling this meeting. The military are preparing for the presidential election in Russia. There are various other matters that the Russian military needed to discuss. But anyway, the principal points that I'm going to highlight that Shoigu made over the course of this conference concern the special military operation, the fighting in Ukraine. And this is what he said, and I'm taking this now from the Russian Defense Ministry's official translation of his statement. I would like to start with the situation in the special military operation zone. After the enemy's counteroffensive failed, the armed forces of the Russian Federation retained the strategic initiative along the entire line of contact. Our units are moving forward, expanding areas of control, improving positions along the front lines. As a result of the Russian troops' actions, Veseloye, Krakhmalnoye, and Avdeyevka were liberated in Kupiansk, Krasny Liban, and Donetsk directions. The Russian group of forces continue to methodically reduce the enemy's combat potential. As a result of systemic strikes, Ukrainian losses in January exceeded 23,000 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded. More than 3,000 pieces of weaponry, including foreign-made samples, were destroyed. This includes German-made Leopard tanks, US-made Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Patriot and HIMARS combat vehicles. In January, the Russian armed forces launched 127 strikes by precision weapons at Ukrainian military infrastructure and military-industrial complex facilities. Weapons production, modernization and repair facilities, arsenals, military airfields, logistical bases, deployment areas of Ukrainian units and foreign mercenaries were struck. In order to prevent the defense from collapsing, the Ukrainian leadership is throwing its remaining reserves into the battle and hastily carrying out another forced mobilization. The Zelensky regime carries out terrorist acts against Russian civilians to show its Western handlers some success. At the same time, the leaders in Kiev do not shy away from killing their own citizens. For example, last week, a Russian aircraft with Ukrainian servicemen on board transported for exchange was attacked and shot down from Ukrainian territory. This speaks of the cynical nature of Kiev's actions, which is ready to commit any crime to achieve selfish goals. The Russian group of forces continue to perform tasks set out by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief is, of course, the President, Vladimir Putin. Now, let's unpack this. The first thing to say is that Shoigu says that the armed forces, the Russians, have the strategic initiative along the entire line of control. Now, notice that in this address, he does not use the word active defense. He's not qualifying those words by referring to active defense. He's simply saying that they hold the initiative. And he says that our units are moving forward, expanding areas of control, improving positions along the front lines. So it's a rather more upbeat assessment in some ways than his last one. He seems to be implying that the Russians are moving gradually from the phase of defense, the successful defense they carried out at the time of the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the summer. Then there was a period of active defense, which is what he was talking about in his most recent speech. But now he's talking simply about the Russians holding the strategic initiative, moving forward, expanding areas of control, improving positions along the front lines. And he gives a list of places which the Russians have captured, and it must be said immediately and in parentheses that these are small places. They're talking about villages. We're not talking here about any major towns. He's talked about Veseloye, which is in the Siversk area, Krakhmalnoye, which is, of course, in the Kupiansk area, and Avdeyevka, which is also, of course, in the Kupiansk area. And note that he refers to Veseloye as being having been captured by the Russians, liberated, as he would say. A couple of days ago, as I reported in my video, the time when there were all the rumors and reports, claims that we first started to hear them, to be more precise, that General Zaluzhny had been dismissed. All the reports of a political crisis in Kiev, we got a flood of reports from the Ukrainians, all claiming that all kinds of dramatic things had happened, that Veseloye had been recaptured, that the Tsar's hunting lodge fortress area in Avdeyevka had also been recaptured, that a bridgehead, a new bridgehead, had been established in Krinky. I expressed some skepticism in my programs about the likelihood that all of these things had really happened. And, well, we now know for a fact that the Ukrainians have not been able to recapture the Tsar's hunting lodge area in Avdeyevka. There's now ample confirmation that that area remains firmly under Russian control. I'm going to return to what's happening in Avdeyevka shortly, and the developments there are dramatic, but they're all very much in Russia's favor. And here we have Shoigu, and he seems to be talking about Veseloye having been liberated, which strongly suggests that it too remains under Russian control, in which case those Ukrainian claims that the Ukrainians had recaptured it turn out to have been wrong as well. But having said that, Shoigu says that the Russians have the strategic initiative. He says that they are moving forward, expanding areas of control, but he's careful to say that so far all they're doing is improving positions along the front line and are continuing to reduce methodically the enemy's combat potential. So it remains strategic attrition. That is what the Russians are doing for the moment. There is no general offensive by the Russian military being undertaken in Ukraine at the present time. The Institute for the Study of War would like us to think that there is. The Kirill Budanov has been giving interviews this week. He's been talking as if there was a great Russian offensive underway along the combat lines, but no Russian official anywhere has spoken about the Russian army being involved in an offensive in the area of the special military operation. And Shoigu does not use the word offensive in these comments. The aim for the moment continues to be aggressive attrition. in Shoigu's words, methodically reducing the enemy's combat potential. And he claims that Ukrainian losses in terms of men, Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, that these losses exceed 23,000. Now, as I said previously, that actually correlates quite well. 23,000 in January. That correlates quite well with information we're now starting to get from Ukraine itself. It looks as if the Defense Ministry's estimates of Ukrainian losses, it's important to stress again, these are dead and wounded. There's been a big debate, there was a big debate about this earlier in the war, but now we can definitely say these are dead and wounded. That these figures that the Defense Ministry have been giving seem to correspond closely with reports that are coming, admittedly unofficial reports that are coming from Ukraine, and with Ukrainian demands from the military that there has to be another major mobilization in Ukraine, that Ukraine needs to call up 500,000 men, that it needs to call up at least 30,000 men a month in order to replace combat losses. And we can see that Shoigu is giving conservative figures, if anything, 23,000, whereas there are even some people in Ukraine, like the former Attorney General, Yuri Lutsenko, who put the monthly loss rate higher at up to 23,000 in terms of dead and wounded. And Shoigu then said that on the battlefronts, 3,000 pieces of weaponry have been destroyed. He says Leopard tanks have been destroyed. There's actually film and pictures of this. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles have been destroyed. Again, there's film and pictures of this. And also Patriot and HIMARS combat vehicles. Now, there's been a lot of denials in the West about losses of Patriot launch systems, but I think that there is now accumulating evidence that quite a few Patriot batteries have indeed been destroyed. There was reports before winter that an entire Patriot battery had been destroyed on a railway siding in Kherson region, for example. And there's more reports that various missile strikes on Kiev itself over the course of January have inflicted more damage to the Ukrainian air defense system in Kiev, which is largely based around the Patriot. And in fact, I've discussed in several programs that the high visibility of Russian cruise missiles flying over Kiev, essentially unchallenged, and Ukrainian acknowledgement of their failure in shooting down Russian missiles and drones, all point to a gathering crisis in the Ukrainian air defense system. And Shoigu also says that HIMARS combat vehicles have been destroyed. This is a difficult vehicle to find and destroy. The whole nature, the whole essence of the HIMARS is that it launches its rockets very quickly, and very quickly the vehicle then scoots away and hides, making it very difficult for the Russians to destroy it after it's launched its rockets. But I gather that there have been now some pictures which do seem to confirm that several HIMARS vehicles have indeed been destroyed over the course of the last few weeks. And then, of course, he talks about the major missile strikes, 127 strikes by precision weapons. He is now referring to the, I think it's 4 in total, waves of cruise missile strikes on Ukrainian territory that took place in January. He talks about how this has caused major damage to Ukrainian industrial facilities and logistics centers and warehouses. I should say that a source who has provided me with a great deal of information has provided me recently with a breakdown of what he believes to be the total amount of shells that the Russians have been able to destroy in Ukraine through these sort of missile strikes. Now, I want to stress this appears to be figures for the entire period of the conflict, going all the way back to February 2022. But it looks as if the Russians, through missile strikes, might have destroyed up to 500,000 shells in logistic bases and infrastructure facilities and warehouses. It's a very interesting email altogether, but I don't feel able to speak in more detail about it because, again, I worry that if I do, I will reveal facts about the source. But anyway, that's what this person said. It's a figure I cannot confirm, but anyway, there we are. Anyway, he then complains about how the Ukrainians are still sending assassins across the Russian border, which they are, and launching drone attacks on Russian cities, which they are, though with increasingly limited effectiveness. And then he talks a great deal about the Ilyushin 76 incident, the one in which the Ukrainian prisoners were killed. And he also talks at length about the shelling. Well, he touches on the Ukrainian shelling of Russian cities. But he says that the Russians continue to perform the tasks set out by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, who is, as I said, is Vladimir Putin. So, overall, here we have the information. The Russians becoming more aggressive on the battlefronts, starting to push harder. And the key words, I think, in Shoigu's address ultimately were these: in order to prevent the defense from collapsing, the Ukrainian leadership is throwing its remaining reserves into the battle and hastily carrying out another forced mobilization. So, Ukraine, according to Shoigu, under this pressure that the Russians are exerting all across the combat line, are now being forced to throw in their last remaining reserves. And that is, of course, what aggressive attrition is all about. It's draining the Ukrainian forces, weakening them to the point that when the big Russian offensive comes, which will certainly happen after the spring Rasputitsa, it won't happen before, and may happen at some point in the late spring or summer, the Ukrainians are no longer in a position to withstand it. It is the opposite of what happened last year with the Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainian offensive was launched after a period of time, the winter and the spring, when, because of Ukraine's own inability to launch an offensive at that time. The Russians, far from being attritioned, were actually getting stronger. They were increasing the size of their forces in the area of the special military operation. They were stockpiling shells, producing more tanks and artillery, increasing the size of their air force, and building these enormous fortified lines and laying these vast minefields. So the Russians, in advance of the Ukrainian offensive of the summer, got a lot stronger. And in fact, they were getting stronger throughout that time at a faster rate than the Ukrainians were. This time, it is the other way round. The party that is intending eventually to go on the offensive, which is Russia, is getting stronger, and the Ukrainians are getting weaker. And the reason the Ukrainians are getting weaker is because, unlike what happened last year during the winter and the spring, when the Ukrainians were unable to maintain attacks on the Russians, were unable to engage in aggressive attrition, they had to leave the Russians alone. And the Russians were able to focus on Bakhmut, win the Battle of Bakhmut, grind the Ukrainians down there. The Russians were already conducting aggressive attrition then, before Ukraine launched its offensive. And they were also carrying out missile strikes on the Ukrainian energy system, carrying out aggressive attrition against Ukraine's air defense system. And by the way, as has been pointed out to me, also by a source, those attacks on the energy system severely disrupted Ukraine's ability to keep its railways operating, slowing down the movement of troops, slowing down the deployment of troops by Ukraine throughout the winter and spring of last year, ensuring that the Ukrainians were not able to carry out attacks, thereby sparing the Russians from aggressive attrition by the Ukrainians against themselves, and giving the Russians the time and space to build up their great fortified lines and to prepare for the Ukrainian offensive, which they knew would come. This winter, it is the opposite. The country, the party that does intend to go onto the offensive in the summer is preparing for that offensive by weakening the defender. That is, in a nutshell, what the point of aggressive attrition is. Anyway, that's what Shoigu had to say. All very interesting and very suggestive. But what is actually going on the battlefronts? Well, there has actually been quite a lot of dramatic news over on the battlefronts. But before I turn to it, I just want to deal with one particular incident. There's been a lot of film there's been a film circulating, which the Ukrainians have released, which shows or appears to show Ukrainian seaborne drones crashing into and destroying a Russian missile corvette near, apparently, to Sevastopol. And there's lots of pictures that show smoke billowing out of this missile boat, a missile corvette. The name of it, apparently, is the Ivanivets, and the Ukrainians claim that the Russians, that this missile boat has been lost. Now, it might have been. The Russian Defense Ministry has said absolutely nothing about this incident at all. And without confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry, it's very difficult to get a sense. Well, it's impossible, basically, to corroborate Ukrainian accounts of this affair. Now, the film is very dramatic, and it could be true, but I have to say the Ukrainians have in the past released film, not perhaps quite as dramatic as this, but they have released film of Ukrainian seaborne drones crashing into or appearing to get very close to Russian warships, and have claimed that these warships have been damaged or even sunk in some way, except subsequently it has turned out otherwise, and the warships in question have sailed back into Sevastopol or other Russian ports in the Black Sea, looking intact and undamaged. Now, on balance, looking at this film, and let me say again, I'm not the best person either to see film of this nature, blurry as it inevitably is, or to analyze it in any detail. Seeing this particular film, I think on this case, Ukrainian claims are likely true. But if this particular ship, the Ivanivets, turns up somewhere, again, perhaps badly damaged, but not quite sunk, well, I will not be surprised. The thing to say about this particular warship is that it is indeed a missile corvette, but it's a very old one. It dates from the late 1970s or 1980s. It's a leftover from the Soviet Navy, rather like the cruiser Moskva was. Its radar and electronic systems and air defense systems are not really, well, they're not remotely up to the standard of today. And though it does have powerful supersonic anti-ship missiles, the Mosquito missiles, these two by now are becoming fairly old, and, well, they're not remotely comparable to the Onyx supersonic missiles that Russian warships of today mount. So this is an old missile corvette. It was probably in line for scrapping. The Russians have much more advanced, far more modern missile corvettes joining the Black Sea fleet, of the Buyan and other classes. You can find all these details on the internet of all the modern Russian missile corvettes. This particular warship would not be capable of participating in the Russian missile strikes on Ukraine. I gather that the Mosquito missile does not really have a good land attack capability. So, as I said, perhaps some people have been killed on this ship when it was struck. Perhaps this has been a dreadful loss for the families of the sailors of this warship, but it is not a significant loss for the Black Sea Fleet. The Moskva, which is a big ship and which was the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, its loss was a heavy blow. It was a heavy symbolic blow, even though it was an old ship, and even though its weapon systems had become outdated, the Moskva did at least have very powerful radars, which played an important role, enabling the Russians to maintain air and sea control of the western Black Sea area. To the extent that the Russians have been having problems in the western Black Sea area, it's partly because they don't have the kind of radar cover that for a time the Moskva was providing them. So the loss of the Moskva was a real blow to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. In terms of its military capabilities, the possible loss of this corvette would not be. I would add, by the way, that I mentioned that the Ukrainians have overstated, given straightforwardly wrong accounts about the destruction of Russian warships in the past. One recent example was a strike that took place some months ago on Crimea. There was an attack on a shipyard in Sevastopol, and a submarine, the Rostov-on-Don, was there being repaired. And there were a lot of people who were claiming that the submarine was a write-off and that it had been so severely damaged that it would have to be scrapped. But it's now turned out that the damage, though not inconsiderable, was nowhere near as extensive as had been assumed, and that the Rostov-on-Don is in the process of completing repairs and will be rejoining the Black Sea Fleet shortly. So there we go. There's no real certainty so far about this incident. On balance, I do think this corvette has indeed been destroyed, but I might be wrong about that. If it has been, it is a tragedy for the crew and for their families, if, as is likely, some have been killed, but it will not change the situation on the battlefronts to any degree. And now, coming to the situation on the battlefronts, the situation there is appalling. It is getting very bad for Ukraine indeed. And we have now a cascade of reports coming from Avdeyevka. These confirm, as I said, that the Tsar's hunting lodge, which a couple of days ago the Ukrainians were claiming they had recaptured, these confirm that the Tsar's hunting lodge remains firmly under Russian control. That is indisputable. But it is now clear that the Russians have been, in fact, enlarging their area of control. They seem to be gaining more control of areas in southern Avdeyevka. And they also seem to be rolling up Ukrainian defense positions to the southwest of the built-up area of Avdeyevka itself. They also seem to be steadily working towards encircling Ukrainian troops in a filtration plant. This is a fortified position to the west of Avdeyevka. All of this is very bad news. But the really alarming information from a Ukrainian perspective is that, again, film published by the Ukrainians themselves has shown the Russians far ahead of where most mappers had assumed they were, fighting in the central parts of Avdeyevka and advancing into central Avdeyevka from the north, suggesting that the Russians have been able to capture a significant part of the territory immediately to the north of Avdeyevka, that they have indeed managed to break into Avdeyevka in this area. And as I said, they've actually managed to start fighting in the central parts of Avdeyevka, where, by the way, there were a few days ago, there were reports that the Russians were conducting heavy bomb strikes. And we can now start to see why. The bombing was clearly intended to prepare the ground for a Russian assault on central Avdeyevka, which is now in the process of taking place. So Avdeyevka is coming under attack from the Russians, now firmly consolidated in the southern part of this town, and from the northeast to be precise, with the Russians pushing deep into central Avdeyevka itself. Now, the Ukrainians do still have troops in Avdeyevka, and they've also got some tanks, and there's pictures of Ukrainian tanks operating in Avdeyevka. The battle is far from over. The Ukrainians made intense attempts to counterattack the Russians in southern Avdeyevka. As I said, they claimed for a time that they'd recaptured the Tsar's hunting lodge. That, it turns out, is untrue. But they were able for a time to counterattack, and perhaps they will try to counterattack and push back these Russian troops that are assaulting Avdeyevka from the north as well. But if they fail, if the Russians are able to continue their advance deeper into central Avdeyevka, then the town will be cut in half. Ukrainian troops in the south of Avdeyevka would risk being cut off, and at that point, it seems to me the situation in Avdeyevka would not be critical, it would be worse than that. We would be looking at a situation where the entire town was in the process of being overrun, and where Ukrainian defense was likely, all the indications were, that the Ukrainian defenses were on the brink of complete collapse. So, a deep crisis for the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka. An equally severe crisis, apparently, for the Ukrainians in Marinka, in the area around Marinka. Again, lots of reports now of accumulating Russian advances. It looks as if this village of Novomikhailovka is now being encircled. There are still entry points. The Ukrainians can still pull back their troops there, or even reinforce them if that's what they choose to do. But it does look as if Ukrainian positions around Novomikhailovka are weakening. The Russians seem to be incrementally gaining control of all the ground nearby, and the Russians seem to be making significant progress in capturing other places in the Marinka area. They seem to be advancing purposefully towards the west and the south and even the north to some degree. And, well, overall, the situation in the Marinka area, which, as I've discussed previously, impacts on Ukraine's ability to continue to hold out in Vuhledar, it's cracking there as well. Perhaps, however, the most dramatic news is coming from the Liman area. Now, over the last couple of days, the Russian Defense Ministry has been publishing reports of Ukrainian losses in the Liman area, casualties there. It's over the last couple of days, Ukrainian losses have been consistently, this is according to the Russians, consistently above 200 men a day, dead and wounded, 280 men a day, 280 men on one particular day. More on some days than the Ukrainians have been suffering in the Bakhmut area, where, as I have said, the fighting has been the most intense throughout 2023 and 2024, what we've been, the 2024 that we've had up to now, over the, as compared with any other part of the front line. And again, I'm getting the sense that the Ukrainians have been throwing all they have in an attempt to try to stem Russian advances in the Liman area towards the Zherebets River, and that they're finding it impossible to do so, and that Ukrainian defenses are cracking there as well. And there's been less news from the Kupiansk area, but it's clear that the Russians are gradually rolling up the villages in the area where they have made their biggest advances up to this point. And it's likely that at some point over the next couple of days or weeks, they will make a concerted push towards the Oskol River, outflanking Kupiansk from the south, and perhaps they will make another attempt to storm Sinkovka, a village which has been something of a bone in their throat. They made various attempts to capture it before, without succeeding in doing so. So overall, a very dangerous and very bad situation for the Ukrainians on the battlefronts. Less news from places like Krinky. Apparently intense battles being fought in the Bakhmut area. There's some suggestions that the Russians were pushed back a couple of meters, 100 meters or so, in the fighting in Bogdanovka. The Ukrainians need to prevent the Russians capturing the whole of Bogdanovka if they're to hold on to Chasov Yar. But frankly, it looks only a matter of time before the Russians do capture Bogdanovka. And according to Radovka, at least, the Russians are managing gradually to break into Ivanivska and appear to be making actual and significant progress there. So a very, very bad situation on the battlefronts. And Politico is now saying that the overall situation with artillery shell shortages in Ukraine is now so bad that Ukraine has no options to conduct offensives. Kirill Budanov might be telling everybody, just wait, in the spring the Russian offensive will peter out, and then we in Ukraine will be back on the attack. That's what Budanov is saying. Victoria Nuland might come to Kiev and might be saying that the Ukrainians have nice surprises for Putin in store. The reality on the battlefronts, as Politico is all but acknowledging, is that the Ukrainians are now on the defensive. They don't have enough shells. The aggressive attrition is working, as Shoigu is saying, and the Russians are able to push forward and are doing so right across the battlefronts. And the game of musical chairs being played out in Kiev, Zelensky up, Zaluzhny down, Zelensky up, Poroshenko maneuvering, Klitschko maneuvering, all of this, that's not going to change the situation either. And amidst this situation of Ukrainian collapse, military collapse, because in a slow motion way, a very slow motion way, that is what we are now seeing. The European Union has decided to give another 55 billion euros to Ukraine. This was the money that Orban stopped the European Union giving to Ukraine last year. He said that there needed to be annual reviews. He said that the Europeans are throwing good money after bad. He said that Ukraine is bankrupt. He said he didn't understand why the European Union was giving European taxpayers' money to a Ukraine that is going to lose all of this money. And he suggested that rather than simply give the Ukrainians actually 4 checks over 4 years, because this 55 billion euro package is spaced out over 4 years. He suggested that it be subject to annual reviews, and so that people could see how this money was being used and what real effect it was having. And Orban's objections of last year provoked a massive hissy fit from the leadership of the EU, stern and furious editorials right across the media, claims that Orban was leading a pro-Russian party within the European Union, that he was a Russian Trojan horse. All of those things. Warnings circulated and published in the Financial Times that unless Orban backed down and signed on the dotted line and gave Ukraine the money that it needed, well, unless that happened, the EU would work to destabilize Hungary's economy. They would try to impose sanctions on Hungary. They would do all that they could to force and bully and pressure Orban to fall into line. And to a certain extent, fall into line he has done. He has, after all, agreed to this spending package, which is on its face, and as he's all but admitted, a bizarre thing to do, given that, as he says himself, Ukraine is bankrupt, the economy is on life support, it only continues to take over because of the financial assistance it's getting from the European Union and from the United States. US funding for Ukraine is now in jeopardy. There's no sign that Congress is going to move forward with a funding package for Ukraine. I would say that to those who think that this European agreement to get funding for Ukraine is going to persuade Republicans in the House of Representatives to change their minds, I don't think it's going to make the slightest difference. That's my own view. I think American politics is purely American focused. What the Europeans do isn't going to interest congressional Republicans at all. That's my own take on that. But anyway, funding from the United States, for the moment at least, isn't coming. And of course, something that Orban is careful not to say, Ukraine is losing the war. He says that the situation in Ukraine is a stalemate, that there's no military solution, that there's no pathway to Ukrainian victory. He said all of those things, all of which, by the way, are up to a point true. But of course, the reality is worse than that. Ukraine is actually losing, and it is losing now at an accelerated speed. That, as I said already, is why we have the political crisis in Kiev that we do. So, is this a good moment to give 55 billion euros to Ukraine? Well, it's important to say that Orban did get some concessions from the Europeans. Firstly, he insisted that this funding be subject to annual review, and it seems that some kind of review will take place each year. Apparently, the Europeans made it clear that they would not, however, accept that Orban would be in a position to veto further funding over the course of those reviews, which begs the question, in that case, of what sort of reviews are these supposed to be? Just saying. And of course, there's supposed to be some sort of bigger review after 2 years with a kind of break clause, which, again, apparently doesn't mean that Orban would have a veto right over further money, but it would again supposedly make it easier for the European Union to stop going on providing this money. I have to say, it all seems unbelievably vague to me, and I don't even understand what it means, and I suspect in practice it means nothing of substance. I suspect these were face-saving things done in order to make it easier for Orban to agree to this package. But anyway, putting all that aside, what exactly is this money going to do? Now, basically, what it amounts to, the money that's being provided, is not to develop Ukraine's economy. That is beyond repair at the moment. It's intended to pay the salaries of civil service officials, to pay pensions, all of those things. Very necessary and worthy things. And in some ways, and this is a point that Orban himself made, not the kind of thing that it's easy to object to. Though why the European Union should be paying the salaries and pensions of people in Ukraine, which is not, of course, an EU country, well, people can argue about that. I'm not going to discuss that aspect of this in this program. But, as Orban said, it will still keep Ukraine on life support. It's not going to change anything. It's just throwing more money at Ukraine, averting the moment when the country collapses into hyperinflation. Perhaps it's the sort of thing you should do at a time, at this point in the war, given the enormous role the EU has played in the Ukraine crisis up to now, and the way in which it has colluded in the manner in which Ukraine was, in Professor Mearsheimer's words, led up the primrose path. So maybe it's the sort of debt of honor you should pay. But if you're going to do that, if that's going to be your approach, then surely you should be working overtime to find some way to bring the war to an end. You should be negotiating. That is the only way in which a financial package like this, I would have thought, makes any sense at this time. But no EU officials apparently are thinking in that way. None of the European governments is seriously thinking in that way. They all understand that they don't have weapons that they can go on supplying to Ukraine in large quantities anymore. They know that there are doubts about American military support. They know that the United States is being pulled into a potential crisis in the Middle East. And they know that in an election year, funding for foreign wars tends to be unpopular in the United States, and that the main opposition leader, Donald Trump, is opposing funding for this one. So you would have thought in this situation, given that they're investing all this money, they would be trying to find some mechanism through which to conduct negotiations. Not at all, it would seem. And instead, they continue to write out checks, handing over more money to Ukraine. Money which, given that the country is heading for military defeat and potential collapse, is simply going to be lost. No, maybe the Europeans hope to compensate themselves from Russian assets. They've now said that they will start to confiscate interest, accrued interest, on the capital sums that have been frozen. As I said, I don't understand the logic of that, the legal logic of that. If you acknowledge that the capital belongs to a third party, surely the interest does too. I've seen some people suggest that this seizure of this interest could be treated as some form of taxation. I very, very much doubt that this is the case, and I suspect also that sovereign immunity principles apply to the interest as well. So anyway, it doesn't look as if they're going to be able to seize the capital itself. I mean, what is it that they are doing? It doesn't make any kind of sense to me, given the realities on the battlefields. Seymour Hersh has another long article out about the sacking of Zaluzhny. He says that some people in the United States are horrified about the fact that Zelensky is trying to sack him. They're hoping against hope that Zaluzhny might be the person who might find some means to end the war. I'm going to return to that article of Seymour Hersh because I think it's interesting and it departs to some extent from some of the things which I took him to say in his previous articles. There doesn't seem to be any reference, for example, to General Gerasimov, Zaluzhny's supposed interlocutor, agreeing that Ukraine could join NATO. From what I can tell, in fact, from this article, it doesn't seem as if Zaluzhny has been negotiating with the Russians so much as with the Americans, which might be true. But anyway, there is this article by Seymour Hersh saying that some Americans, at least, are dismayed about the possible dismissal of Zaluzhny because they're counting on him to find a negotiated way to end the war. To say that I'm doubtful would be an understatement. That's a misunderstanding of Zaluzhny himself, by the way. But officially, the US government has no plan to end the war, and I don't think any such plan, any such actual plan on the part of any Western government, in fact, exists. Instead, what the Europeans do is just go on writing the checks, giving money to someone who, as Orban correctly says, is bankrupt and is going down. European economy is in recession. Economists are talking about long-term stagnation. Given this eccentric way of managing finance, is anyone surprised? Anyway, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. There'll be remember that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please remember that you can check out our shop, buy yourself the amazing things there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.